There's one more thing I'd like to say about the field experience in 1985 that ended up, that in the end brought us to the ANU and to the writing of my book, Deep Water. And it concerns that fieldwork in 1985, but also I think every other period of fieldwork that I've done in Vanuatu, and it's, I think, of interest to people going into the kind of tropical conditions that we as anthropologists sometimes choose to work in. I developed quinine-resistant or chloroquine-resistant malaria in 1985. I had finished, thank goodness, I had finished my fieldwork in Port Orrery, which, as I've described, was not easy. And we were in Longana on east part of Ambai, and I began to feel I was down at somebody's house. Down, I say down because these islands are so vertical. They're like Hawaii. There's a word for uphill and down, inland and seaward, and uphill and downhill. So I was downhill, meeting with an old fellow who had a vast collection of World War II memorabilia, blankets and cutlery and coins and you name it, guns, no bullets, and flags, Navy, U.S. Navy memorabilia. And I just began to feel off. And by the time I'd climbed back up, I was with my daughter, I'm pretty sure, we had climbed back up the hill to Wailingi, which was where we were living. I was really feeling sick. I was like flu-like symptoms. I knew what malaria felt like because I'd had it by then several times. The old garden variety malaria where you have a huge headache, and then you start to feel really chilled, and then you start to feel really feverish and sweaty, and this takes about 24 hours, and then it breaks, and you're okay for a day, and then it hits again. That was the kind I had, a recurring kind of malaria. And I had it from, I think the first time was during maybe 1970, but certainly 78. And the last time I was sick with it was in 1996, and it was 18 months after I'd left the field conditions. So it was something to be taken very seriously. We took chloroquine prophylactically like every Sunday, but by 1985 there were resistant strains. I think they were around earlier than that, but they were, because I believe they developed in resistance to malaria treatment in Vietnam. But by the mid-'80s, they were in Vanuatu. So I didn't spot this as malaria. I just knew I wasn't well, and I just got weaker and weaker and weaker, and I was nauseous, I was vomiting, and I was really feverish. And a couple of days passed, and I was getting worse, and I just couldn't hold anything, even liquid. I couldn't hold anything down. And so I turned to some women who were known as native healers, and I said, I don't know what I've got. I don't know, when am I making me, but I'm really sick, and can you help me? Maybe you know what this is. There was this notion that there was sick belong white men and sick belong, ni Vanuatu, and that the white people just didn't get sick from some things that made ni Vanuatu sick, but white people could get sick from things they were fine with. So I just needed a diagnosis. The nearest, there was no hospital anymore at the Anglican Mission Station. There had been in the early 70s, but by 1985 it was just a dispensary, kind of a nurse, a dresser they called them, was there to dress wounds and hand out medicine. But I don't think there was any particular, I'm not even sure they were in radio contact with a hospital or a doctor. The nearest hospital was on the island of Santo, and the only way to get there at that time was by plane. The weather was terrible. The planes weren't coming in. And I didn't know how sick I was. I wasn't sure if I needed to be evacuated. Bill was very worried. The kids were worried. They had a farewell feast that had been pre-scheduled, and so they went ahead and did it. So the pictures are all of the three of them looking kind of gloomy at the farewell feast, and everybody was worried about me. So the women met with me, and one of them said, "I will sleep on it. I'll dream on it." And she dreamed, and she saw little people who wanted to take me to their place. And they were little people that she believed from a place where we had gone swimming. We never went swimming in the creeks. We went down to the ocean usually, but where we lived was, by the time you hiked back from the ocean, you were sweaty all over again. So we went sideways across the mountain to a creek that had a swimming hole or clothes washing place and swimming place that the local people used, but they never wanted us to go there because of the risk of flash floods. The woman who worked as my first translator was killed along with her small children in a flash flood. And they came down like express trains from the top of the mountain. It could be pouring rain on the top and you wouldn't know it down below. So people always stopped at the creek and they listened for the sound of the freight train, which was the flood. Well, on this occasion, it was deemed safe to swim there, and we had CUSO volunteers visiting as house guests. And they were fishermen who just wanted to keep going. They were always inventing a game, you know. Ooh, who can throw this coconut husk and hit that coconut on that stump and knock it off? So they were always on the move, and we went swimming. And this woman, when she dreamed, she saw the spirits of that swimming place who wanted to keep me. And I said, "I'm way too tall for them." She said, "Doesn't matter. They'll make you fit into their little house." So she had a remedy for me, and meanwhile, Bill was being distracted by the local chief out front because he didn't want me to be dealing with my husband didn't want me to be going for the bush cure. He thought it was better if they got me out and got me to Western medicine, which I would not have been opposed to. It just wasn't happening because of the weather. And I thought maybe these people were onto something. So they did a leaf remedy for me that I had to drink, and I hadn't been able to keep anything down for days. And this stayed down, and they took a young coconut and they lit it on fire. Had me stand in our kitchen, which had a coral floor. I could barely stand. Both two of them held me up. They lit this fire between my bare feet, small fire, and wafted the smoke all over me and sang over it, chanted over it. And I found myself wishing that I could actually take notes, but I really couldn't. And then they put me back in bed, and I began to get better. And I was definitely better, but by the next morning the plane could come in. So I went to the airport, was driven in the truck to the airport and flown out to Santo, where they put me on intravenous quinine or quinine, which brought the fever really right down, and I recovered. I lost a lot of weight. I was really, really weak. But the pictures of me from that time are horrifying. But I lived through it. And on the way to the airport, which was the only time I was outdoors in daylight after they'd given me the cure, I noticed the world was like incredibly bright. I think my pupils must have been really dilated. I don't know what was in what they gave me, but I suspect something with atropine. And whatever it was, I'll never know if that saved my life, or if it was the quinine that saved my life, or if it just would have run its course. But I am still very grateful to those women for being courageous enough to step in where the white man didn't really want them to be, but he was distracted by the chief at the front, and to intervene because they felt that if they didn't, they might lose me. So that kind of caring and sense of responsibility was just so striking and so touching. Later, we had the opportunity to contribute to a book called The Humbled Anthropologist, which a bunch of Pacific anthropologists contributed to. This fellow, DeVita, was a student of Ed Cook, who had been a founder of the Oceania Association, and he thought it would be fun to collect all of the stories about what went wrong in the field. So this story, some of them are very funny. Dorothy Counts and David told one about having too many bananas. and careful what you wish for, you know. And this one was not funny, but we wrote it. My husband was by far the lead author in this, but we wrote it as a dialogue. And so it was called To Die on and By, or On the Possibility of Doing Fieldwork Forever. And it's been one of the articles that has been most widely reprinted in my 50-plus articles. And it's actually been performed as a play in a classroom. One of my students did it, not in my class, but in a colleague's class at York University, in which one of them played me, one of them played the women, and Bill, and so on. So it's a whimsical take on a very serious moment. When we went back to Vanuatu after that, I mean, it took a lot of courage to go back, frankly. It's probably just as well that there was a moratorium on research in Vanuatu from 1985 to 1994, so I didn't have the opportunity to go back. I don't think I would have if I had the opportunity, because after all, I went in '85 as a researcher, but working with CUSO, not as an expat field worker. So I was keen at the time. This took a lot of the enthusiasm away. I really was concerned that if I got that sick again, I wouldn't live through it. And I wasn't that keen to give my body for science. I still think the greatest risk that we faced as field workers, and I think many others, was riding in the back of trucks, open pickup trucks on dirt roads, but that's an aside. So when we went back after the moratorium, we took various other kinds of anti-malarial prophylactics, mefloquine and other things. And in the end, I just ended up taking chloroquine because the side effects of the other things were really not good, and the long-term consequences of taking prophylactics may have outweighed the risk. I don't know. But it's a tough one for anybody doing fieldwork in malarial areas, because you're there too long to take the heavy-duty prophylactics that you can take going in for a short period. So I don't have an answer to that one. So I'll shift here to the research that I did while at York University and during the moratorium on research in Vanuatu. So it began because I was wanting to do more research, and I couldn't go to Vanuatu, both for health reasons and the moratorium. And I was wanting to do something that used a more geographical, place-based approach, but involved working with people, and that had an applicability to my own tribe, if you like, working with Canadians, middle-class Canadians, if you like. And I did this with Matthew Cooper, who was a friend all through all of this, and had been a professor or supervisor at McMaster. But we worked as colleagues on this project, and we got funding to do. Looking to see when I got funding to do this. We got funding in the late '80s to do research on nonprofit rental housing cooperatives in Toronto and elsewhere in Ontario. We did it at first with small grants from McMaster and York, and then developed it into a major research grant in '89 and '90. Those were one-year shirks in those days. And we looked at two housing cooperatives initially and produced this book, New Neighbors, which focused on the two of them. They were, why do I have a bookmark in here? They were both on Bathurst Quay in Toronto. They both are still on Bathurst Quay in Toronto, which at that time was a bit of a wasteland. One was built on the site of a former baseball stadium, and the other was right out where the quay meets. It was in a former industrial site where the land ends, and there's a little ferry to the Toronto Island Airport. This was a program that had been encouraged with funding from Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation and favorable mortgages. So there were subsidies and mortgages. And our interest was in What if you give citizens citizens who rent more control over their housing, and create an opportunity for more connection with their neighbors? Will they thrive on that? What will they fight over? Because there will be conflict. What are the benefits? What are the drawbacks? And so we followed these brand new co-ops for 3 years, maybe longer. And then we went back about 5 years after that to see how it all worked out for these people. The rental co-ops housed people like Jack, not these two, but in Toronto, one in Hazelton, housed Jack Layton and Olivia Chong. They were very mixed income. And it was a social experiment that we concluded, probably too late, was extremely successful, because by the time we published this book in 1991, the funding had been withdrawn. CMHC had shifted on to something else. And this year, I believe it is, the final subsidies for people living in rental co-ops come to an end. They were hugely successful in the False Creek area of Vancouver, and also in Toronto, but all through Ontario and parts of Quebec, where, in fact, in Quebec, where co-ops are much more established as a housing form, and as a way of organizing businesses. So we could point to the advantages of the co-op as a rental structure. It allowed people all to benefit from the CMHC favorable mortgage. It allowed people who needed deep subsidies to benefit. Like if they lost their jobs, they could still stay where they were. If they needed a substantial subsidy to live in this building, they could do it. It was not ghettoizing poor people or the middle class. And the range of rents was, I think, between a couple $100 and $1,300. This was Windward was at the time waterfront. They've since built things on the sides of it. Harborside was just 1 park away from waterfront. The Windward co-housing was, I think it was 100 units-ish, and it included 25% units for people with disabilities. So there were people who could only live in a unit that was adapted for wheelchairs, side by side with people in similar units with the same basic degree of accessibility who didn't need wheelchairs. You could say it was wasted space. You could say it was a great opportunity not to ghettoize people with disabilities. They could visit in any unit in that complex, and they did. So, and in Harborside, which was the other one, was a townhouse, mostly townhouse and apartment complex, low-rise. There was a huge range of incomes. And some of the things that we looked at were the member selection process, because they did member selection. They interviewed people in their homes. And there's one memorable quote about a woman, I don't think this household is suitable for co-op housing because they can't even form community within their home. Oof. It was some were very stringent, some just figured you couldn't tell from an interview what you were getting, and they just let whoever wanted to move in. Many of them had a waiting list, and the social skills that were needed. How were their efforts to encourage them? Because for people who had been on welfare all their lives, some of the meeting, how do you do a meeting, right? They didn't know that. Or their idea of a meeting was not these bourgeois people's idea of a meeting. Consensus decision-making was new to them. Voting was sometimes new. Putting out their recycles was sometimes new. There were all sorts of things that might be controversial. And for some of the more uptight bourgeois families, it was too much clutter in the backyards. Everybody had a little private area and then a shared common space. The things that they fought over were the same things they fought over in villages in Vanuatu. Can you guess? Where's the edge of my land and the beginning of your land? You can't plant that. That's my land. Your animal's over here and it really belongs over there. Your kid's over here and it really belongs over there. Your kid's bothering my kid, and I think your kid needs to be disciplined. Every one of them played out in the village in Vanuatu. And right there, especially at Harborside, which had this large common area. ironically, I have ended up living in a co-housing community, and I did not pick the name, but others chose the name Harborside for it, which is kind of funny and lovely. We went on to study more about accessibility in housing cooperatives and designing for accessibility, boundary-free design. We participated in the Environmental Design Research Association. I learned a lot there that helped to shape my research back in Vanuatu about social construction of space, especially, about how it is that people construct the spaces that they live in, what they think they're doing, and how people simultaneously construct the same place differently. So that fed back into an article that I wrote in 1992 without benefit of further fieldwork at that time, which appeared in the American Anthropologist. And I suspected, I have no idea what the citation rate is for my articles, but I suspect it's the most widely cited piece that I did. And it was called Empowering Place, Multi-Locality and Multi-Vocality. George Marcus and Durée were publishing it about, Durée, however you say his name, were publishing at the same time. They were way more famous than me. And yet this article made a difference, I think. And it was looking at how is it that, what if you took place as seriously as you took voice? So I'll do an aside on this and then come back into maybe that's enough on the co-ops, really. What would happen if you took place as seriously as people were taking voice in anthropology at that time? There had been a popular or a well-received article by James Fernandez, I think it was, on Andalusia in the American Anthropologist at about that time, looking at the importance of voice and time. And place was often taken as just the background against which things happened, and not interesting in and of itself at that time. And so my suggestion, I think I would have said as an academic, I argued that by looking at how people construct meanings through places, you can see that places are multiply constructed, that it changes over time, it changes with the individual, and that there are often interesting things you can learn from the places, from the ways in which these constructions of place butt up against each other, and the ways in which people talk about their experiences of place. So those were concerns that led me to publish that article, to do a number of other articles along the same lines, and maintain an interest in Vanuatu while I couldn't go there. And then when the moratorium ended, the fieldwork on the co-ops and the co-op subsidies ended, that period of my fieldwork wrapped up. Although we continued to do a few little pieces on social construction of space and housing co-ops and accessibility. But the focus of my research then shifted in 94 to, perhaps we could go back to Vanuatu and do more work there. And what to do? And in 93, 94, I was president of CASCA, so I had the privilege of traveling out to Vancouver and presiding over the meetings out here, which was a lot of fun. I was doing quite a lot of work for the organization at that time, as one does. And I was interviewed about that at I think it was 2014 CASCA meetings when they were filming people about their experiences with the organization. So I think, A, I can't remember what I said, and B, that's probably enough about that, but it was a nice time. I look back now and see the 90s were when I was so busy. My goodness, it was the busiest part of my life. So as the moratorium looked like it was going to end, I guess we knew, can't remember how we knew this, but I applied for a Venner grant to do exploratory research in Vanuatu to see what topics would be well received once the moratorium ended and research was entirely controlled by the indigenous field workers. which was what we knew was going to be the case, and I was all in favor of that, and I figured it would be a very good idea to find out what they wanted to have studied in order to create a viable research project, but also one that would be valuable to the local intelligentsia. So I went with the family, again, on a Vandergren grant in 93, to see what was possible. And I had this idea that looking at my own tribe would be a productive way to go, because I'd been looking at my own tribe in the New Neighbors book. And so I thought, what if, and I was interested in the history, because we'd been there before independence. We were there first in 1969, and the country became independent in 1980, so it was a good chunk of time there. And so I began to develop a plan to do research on the colonial era, and I had this idea of looking at colonial housing as a non-threatening way to interact with former colonial officials, British and French, and Australian, some of them, but officially they were either with the British or, some were with the condominium government as Australians. Anyway, mostly British and Australian, some French, to do research with those people through their houses. And I developed a methodology, and I have a slideshow I could give you, which is like in through the front door. What if you used the access point for the research was the door of the house, and you invite people to remember going in through the front door of their house and talking about what it was like, and through talking about their houses, talking about their colleagues, their families, their relations with their servants, what were the issues that were on their mind, and so on. So I did interviews. I went back on the Vandergren grant to Vanuatu, interacted with the people who were going to be the gatekeepers, notably a fellow named Ralph Regenvanu, who became the director of the Cultural Center, and I had met him at ANU, at the Australian National University, when he was an undergraduate student. And he thought that was a fine idea. We talked about what that would look like, and in the end, probably a couple of years later, negotiated the terms in which I would do research with an Indigenous counterpart. I would do a service for my country, the Vanuatu, of recording sites for a National Historic Register, so I had to learn how to do that, and make all the materials available at the Cultural Center and give some presentations. A great arrangement. And I had lots of support from the field workers who by then had been trained to do that work.